The wind moaned through the jagged cliffs like a mourning spirit, carrying with it a bitterness that settled deep into our bones. At the entrance to the gully, the four of us stood in uneasy silence, our boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The sun had long since disappeared behind the mountains, and the thick autumn fog that clung to the ridges seemed almost alive. Ryan, our unofficial leader, broke the silence, his voice trembling just enough to betray his nerves. "I don't like this. It feels wrong." He had said the same thing 3 times since we left the main trail. But I wasn't about to let doubt derail the expedition. I clutched my camera tighter, silently willing him to stay quiet. This wasn't just another hiking trip for me. It was my chance to finally prove I wasn't the failure everyone believed I was. I wasn't going to let some vague feeling of unease stop me. "We're here to find answers," I said, stepping forward. "And I'm not turning back now." Sarah, ever the practical one, nodded and adjusted her pack, her flashlight beam cutting through the fog. Liam, the youngest of the group, smirked, though even he seemed a little less cocky than usual. "Come on, guys," he said. "It's just a creepy old gully. What's the worst that could happen?" The faint scream that echoed from deep within the cliffs almost seemed like a direct answer to his question. The descent was steeper than I expected, the path winding like a coiled serpent, each step loosening rocks that tumbled into the unseen depths below. The gully walls loomed over us, cold and oppressive, and the trees that lined the cliffs seemed to twist unnaturally in the dim light. It wasn't long before we found the first sign of what we were looking for. A rusted mining helmet, its surface caked with dirt and something darker. Ryan picked it up, his face pale. "This is from the old crew, isn't it?" he asked. But no one answered. A chill ran through me as I snapped a photo, the flash momentarily illuminating the gnarled branches above. We pressed on, though the air grew heavier with each step. The gully seemed to close in around us, the walls narrowing until it felt as though we were walking into the mouth of some great beast. Then we found the journal. It was half buried under a pile of stones, its pages stained and brittle. I flipped through it carefully, but most of the words had faded over time. What I could make out, though, was enough to set my heart racing. We were wrong. Something else down here. It watches, it waits. Before I could read more, a deafening crack echoed through the gully. The ground trembled, and rocks cascaded down from above. We barely managed to dodge the rock slide, but when the dust cleared, we realized there was no turning back. The way we'd come was now buried under a mass of boulders, leaving us with only one option: forward. "This is insane," Ryan muttered, his hands shaking as he adjusted the straps of his pack. I couldn't argue with him, but I couldn't admit it either. I told myself it was just a freak accident, nothing more, but the unease that settled in my chest was impossible to ignore. And then I saw it, a shadow, impossibly tall and unnaturally thin, slipping between the trees at the edge of my vision. The first night in the gully was a restless one. The small clearing we found for our camp felt exposed, and the fire we built seemed too weak to hold back the darkness. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the sliver of sky visible between the cliffs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with suffocating tunnels and the sound of pickaxes striking stone. I woke up gasping, my hands covered in dirt. I had no memory of leaving my tent, but the evidence was there, caked under my nails and smeared across my palms. Ryan wasn't much better off. He sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers with a haunted expression. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shook his head. "I heard something," he said finally. "Voices. They knew things about me. Things I've never told anyone." He wouldn't elaborate, and I didn't press him, but his words left a knot of unease in my stomach. The others seemed on edge as well, even Liam, whose usual bravado had been replaced by a nervous energy that made him jump at every sound. By the second day, the gully seemed to have changed. The paths we thought we'd mapped out twisted in ways that didn't make sense, leading us in circles or to dead ends. Sarah was the first to notice the strange markings carved into the rock symbols that none of us could identify, though they seemed to pulsate faintly when touched. It was Sarah, too, who spotted the figure standing at the edge of the clearing that night. "I saw him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was just watching. I think it was one of the miners." The tension finally boiled over when Liam revealed the artifact he'd stolen from the mining town. A rusted pickaxe that he'd hidden in his pack. "Are you insane?" Ryan snapped, his voice shaking with anger. "You brought that thing here without telling us. Do you even know what you've done?" The argument escalated quickly, the group splintering into accusations and recriminations. Liam insisted he hadn't believed the stories about the curse, but his pale face and trembling hands told a different story. I tried to play mediator, but my own anger simmered just beneath the surface. When Sarah disappeared that night, it felt like the gully itself had turned against us. Her flashlight was the only trace we found, its weak beam flickering in the thick fog. We called her name until our voices were hoarse, but the only response was the faint echo of our own desperation. Then we heard it. Sarah's voice, faint and distorted, calling for help from somewhere deep within the gully. But as we followed the sound, it grew sharper, angrier, until it no longer sounded like Sarah at all. We stood at the edge of a bottomless shaft, the sound of Sarah's distorted voice bouncing off the walls, like a cruel mockery of hope. My flashlight caught glimpses of her gear, her pack and jacket abandoned just out of reach. "Sarah!" I called, my voice breaking. The reply came, but it wasn't her. The voice sounded like it was dragged through gravel, mimicking her tone, but wrong in a way that sent chills racing down my spine. Liam backed away, his face pale as ash. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered. "We should have never come here." It was then that I realized the gully wasn't just a place. It was alive, feeding on us, twisting our fear into something palpable. Ryan insisted we go down into the shaft to look for Sarah, but I refused. "That's not her," I said, my hands shaking as I tightened my grip on my flashlight. "It's something else." Ryan didn't want to listen, but even he hesitated as the voice grew louder, angrier, a rising cacophony that drowned out our thoughts. It was only when the voice abruptly stopped that we realized the air had grown unnervingly still. The silence pressed down on us like a weight, and for the first time, I felt truly helpless. The gully was no longer content to let us wander blindly. It was toying with us, pushing us to the edge of madness. "We need to move," I whispered, though my legs felt like lead. Liam nodded, but Ryan lingered, staring into the abyss as though hypnotized. I had to physically pull him away, and even then, he kept glancing back over his shoulder, his face pale and haunted. As we continued, the paths twisted and doubled back on themselves, defying any sense of logic or direction. The gully seemed to shift around us, trapping us in a maze that offered no escape. My camera, which I'd brought to document the expedition, began malfunctioning. Every photo I took came out distorted. The images warped and filled with strange, shadowy figures that hadn't been there when I snapped the shots. I tried to tell myself it was just a glitch, but deep down, I knew better. Exhaustion set in, and with it, paranoia. Liam became increasingly agitated, muttering to himself and clutching the cursed pickaxe like it was some kind of talisman. Ryan, on the other hand, grew quieter, his gaze distant and unfocused. "It's my fault," he said suddenly, breaking the uneasy silence. "All of it, I thought. I thought if I came here, I could make things right." When I pressed him for details, he admitted the truth. Years ago, he'd been responsible for the death of his climbing partner, a mistake born of arrogance and carelessness. The guilt had eaten away at him ever since. Ryan's confession seemed to shift something in the gully. The air grew heavier and the shadows deepened, pressing in around us like a living thing. "It's feeding on us," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "On our guilt." Liam scoffed, though his trembling hands betrayed his fear. "That's ridiculous," he said. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He clutched the pickaxe tighter, as though afraid to let it go. That night I couldn't sleep. The fire had long since died, leaving us in near total darkness. I kept my flashlight close, but its weak beam did little to dispel the oppressive shadows. I thought I heard whispers, faint and indistinct. But when I turned to wake the others, I saw that Ryan was already awake, sitting with his back to me. He was muttering to himself, his voice low and frantic. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough to set my nerves on edge. Liam disappeared the next morning. His gear was still there, but he was gone, leaving behind only the cursed pickaxe, its rusted blade gleaming in the dim light. "We have to find him," Ryan said. But I hesitated. Something about the way the pickaxe seemed to hum, faintly and almost imperceptibly, made my skin crawl. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't leave it behind either. I wrapped it in a cloth and strapped it to my pack, though the weight of it felt heavier than it should have. As we searched for Liam, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They called to us by name, revealing things we'd never spoken aloud. My guilt over abandoning my sister years ago resurfaced with a vengeance, the memories sharp and unrelenting. Ryan, too, seemed to be struggling, his steps faltering as the whispers taunted him with his past. It was as though the gully itself had peeled back the layers of our souls, exposing our darkest truths. We found Liam near the edge of another chasm, his face pale and streaked with tears. "It won't let us leave," he said, his voice trembling. "It knows everything, every mistake, every lie. It's in my head." I tried to comfort him, but the words felt hollow. I didn't believe them myself. The gully had us, and it wasn't going to let us go easily. The chasm stretched endlessly before us, its depths swallowed by darkness. Liam wouldn't look at me. He sat on the cold ground, rocking slightly as though trying to soothe himself. But the panic in his eyes betrayed him. "We have to keep moving," I urged, though I wasn't sure where I thought we could go. Ryan was silent, staring into the abyss as if it might answer some unspoken question. The air felt thicker here, almost suffocating, and the whispers grew louder, their voices intermingling until I couldn't tell one from another. "Do you hear them?" Liam asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're laughing at us," I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to admit that I heard them too, that the whispers had turned into cruel, mocking laughter, echoing in my mind like shards of glass. "They're trying to break us," I said finally, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The truth was, I could feel the cracks forming in my own resolve. My guilt over my sister's death gnawing at me like a living thing. The path ahead was steep and treacherous, the loose rocks shifting beneath our feet with every step. I gripped the cursed pickaxe tightly, its weight dragging at me both physically and mentally. I could feel its presence like a burning brand, a constant reminder of the mistakes that had led us here. "Why did you bring it?" Ryan asked suddenly, his voice sharp with accusation. I didn't answer. I couldn't. By the time we reached the next clearing, the whispers had turned into full-blown voices, each one louder and more distinct than the last. They called out to us, taunting us with our failures, our regrets, our deepest fears. Ryan fell to his knees, his hands pressed tightly against his ears. "Make it stop!" he cried, his voice breaking. I wanted to help him, but I didn't know how. The gully was inside us now, feeding on our pain, and I wasn't sure we had the strength to fight it. Then the shadows began to move. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the flickering light from our flashlights. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that the darkness wasn't just shifting. It was alive. It coiled and writhed around us like smoke, taking on vague, human-like shapes that seemed to watch us with eyes that weren't there. "We're not alone," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. "It's here. It's been here all along." The figure emerged from the shadows without a sound. It was tall and gaunt, its features indistinct but unmistakably human. Its movements were slow and deliberate, as though it was savoring every moment of our fear. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as it approached. And then it spoke not with words, but with a voice that echoed inside my mind, dragging my worst memories to the surface like an anchor pulling me into the depths. "You left her," the voice said, and I knew it was talking about my sister. I could see her face now, clear as day. Her eyes filled with betrayal and sorrow. "You left her, and she died because of you." The words cut deeper than any blade, and I fell to my knees, my heart pounding in my chest. "I didn't mean to," I whispered. Though the words felt hollow, I didn't know. But the figure didn't care. It simply watched, feeding on my despair. Ryan stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "This is my fault, not hers." The figure turned its gaze to him, and I could see the strain in his expression as it tore into his mind the way it had mine. "You let him die," the voice said, and Ryan flinched as though he'd been struck. "You could have saved him, but you didn't. You chose yourself." "Stop it!" I shouted, though I didn't know who or what I was talking to. The figure ignored me, its attention fixed on Ryan. I reached for the pickaxe, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. It felt hot in my hands, almost as though it was alive. Without thinking, I swung it at the figure, the blade slicing through the air with a sickening hum. The figure dissolved into shadow, but the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more frantic, as though the gully itself was angry. "What did you do?" Liam asked, his voice filled with panic. I didn't have an answer. The pickaxe seemed heavier now, its surface glistening with a faint, unnatural sheen. "It's the gully," Ryan said, his voice hoarse. "It's using that thing. It's been using us." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down I knew he was right. The pickaxe wasn't just an artifact. It was a part of the gully, a tool it used to manipulate and control us. We tried to leave the clearing, but the paths kept leading us back to the same spot. No matter which direction we took, we always ended up back where we started. The cursed pickaxe, lying at the center like a beacon. "We're trapped," Liam said, his voice shaking. "It won't let us go." I could see the despair in his eyes, the same despair I felt creeping into my own heart. Ryan was the one who figured it out. "It's our guilt," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "That's what it's feeding on. That's why it won't let us go." His words struck a chord in me, and I realized he was right. The gully thrived on our pain, our regrets, our secrets. If we wanted to escape, we would have to face them head on. "I'll go first," Ryan said, his gaze unwavering. He stepped into the center of the clearing, his hands clenched into fists. "I let him die," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "I let my partner die because I was too proud to admit I needed help. I could have saved him, but I didn't." The whispers grew louder, but Ryan didn't falter. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, the air seemed to shift, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. Ryan turned to me, his expression resolute. "Your turn," he said. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to say it, didn't want to relive the pain, but I knew I had no choice. "I left her," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I left my sister when she needed me most. I thought I was protecting her, but I was wrong. I abandoned her, and she died because of me." The whispers surged, a cacophony of anger and sorrow that seemed to drown out everything else. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry," I sobbed. "I'm so sorry." The ground trembled beneath me, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then I heard Liam scream. The shadows coiled around him, dragging him toward the chasm. "No!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. I tried to reach him, but the shadows were too strong. Ryan grabbed the pickaxe and hurled it into the abyss. His face twisted with determination. The shadows recoiled, and the whispers turned into a deafening wail that echoed through the gully. The ground beneath us began to crumble, and I knew we had to move. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Liam and pulling him to his feet. We sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, the gully collapsing around us. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could do was run and hope that we would make it out alive. We burst out of the gully just as the ground gave way behind us, the cliffs collapsing into a cloud of dust and rubble. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion. Liam sat beside me, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. "It's over," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that he was right. I told myself that the gully was gone, that its curse had been broken, but the memories lingered. The whispers still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. One night, as I reviewed the footage I'd taken in the gully, I noticed something strange. Every video showed not us, but the faces of the miners watching, waiting, their eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. And then, as I shut off the footage, I saw it. My reflection in the darkened screen. It smiled at me, but it wasn't my face. It was the miners, and in that moment, I knew the Gully's secrets would never sleep.